This is a question from Dan, who asks, do you think Birmingham City Council's recent Section 114 notice will mean Labour will be more wary of devolving power to local authorities?
Okay, interesting question. So for any readers who haven't been following this story, this is the effective bankruptcy of Birmingham City Council. That's what a Section 114 notice means. Councils can't actually go bankrupt because they have to deliver certain services as their statutory duty. But it means that it gets stripped down to basic spending. Commissioners come in to help them run it, and they're basically in dire financial straits. And this is the second biggest council in Europe. This is a really big deal. It's England's second city. It's quite extraordinary that this would happen. What's happened here is slightly specific to Birmingham, but there's all sorts of other councils that have been going bankrupt lately as well. What's happened in Birmingham is they've got this outstanding £760 million bill for equal pay claims, and this was after an equal pay case was won back in 2012. And actually the ongoing liability, so the building cost of this, is £14 million per month. And they've also lost money on a new IT system that's been causing problems. I've been writing about Thurrock, which is a borough council, much smaller, but that's run up debts of more than £1.3 billion by investing in risky solar farms, which are nowhere near Thurrock, farms in Wiltshire and all sorts of other places. Woking has gone bust. That's in Surrey, quite a significant council, after speculating on sort of property investment, hotels and high-rises. Similar thing went on in Croydon, Slough, Warrington. Northamptonshire County Council was actually abolished in 2021 after it tried to build its own commercial property portfolio. So I suppose the thing that links all of these is that they have been taking risks with their budgets, partly because of stupid decisions, reckless decisions, but also because of how tight council spending has had to be since 2010, when their central government grants began to be cut. I think they've lost 60% of their spending power since that time. And so you are seeing more and more councils going bankrupt. I remember going to Northamptonshire in 2018, just after that council had collapsed, and speaking to the Tory MP there, Andrew Marr, who's still MP there, Northampton West, and he said to me, other well-run councils will eventually start going bankrupt in 2 or 3 years' time, and that's exactly what's been happening.
Yeah, I think there are 26 councils that are expecting to go bankrupt in the next 2 or 3 years.
Wow.
I mean, it's an endemic problem. I think when Birmingham went bust, the government and the Tories were almost in elation because it was a Labour council. But it's across the board. It's Labour and Conservative councils. Yeah. And as you say, Anoosh, it's an indictment of the system itself. Why do we have councils being forced to go into business? They're not business people. It's not what councils should be doing necessarily. They shouldn't be speculating on property. And it's because they're in such a dire position financially that they feel that they have to take the risks to try and shore up their financial position in the future.
Yeah, I mean, they've also been actively encouraged to take those risks. So the coalition government and the following Tory government ministers were saying councils should be making these commercial investments. They abolished the audit commission, which was the thing that made sure they were spending their money properly, and let them do these kind of risky things.
Yeah, and the other point that you made about essential services is key, because there has been, the central government grants to local government have been cut by about 40% in the past decade, about 60% cut in overall spending power. But as you say, they have to ensure that they deliver essential services, one of the biggest of which is social care. And that means that all their money, their remaining money, is still going to these essential services, which means the cuts to the rest of the services are much, much greater than 40%. Exactly. That's why you're seeing in so many towns across the country, I think, the breakdown of social fabric, the closing of leisure centres, libraries. These are old austerity stories that we were familiar with at the start of the 2010s that are now coming back and becoming permanent. They're becoming a permanent feature of the country, and I think people are recognising that. Yeah,
and I saw that in Thurrock with my own eyes when I went to go and report from there. It's really sad. It's just really sad. So their council tax has gone up 10% this year, might go up by another significant percentage in February when the council's meeting again to discuss raising tax again, and they're getting less and less for it. Their bins are overflowing. The theatre, library, museum complex, very important part of the social fabric there, is condemned. It's going to be closed down. So they're losing that sort of cultural entertainment sort of facility that they have there. The cost of interring your relative's ashes is going to go up 9%. People who need a third parking permit, probably people who have care needs, that's going to go up from 15, I think, to £75. So, you're being pressed for every penny. having to pay more tax but getting much less for it in watching your local area degrade. So this is extremely significant for people's day-to-day lives when councils go bust. It's not just a theoretical thing.
But to the question as
to the question. Sorry, Dan. Poor Dan's just like looking at his watch, like what's going on?
Do you feel there's like a consensus around handing more control out to around the country? I don't feel like that's going to change. I feel like we're an outlier when it comes to kind of like developed nations, just how centralised all of like our economic levers are. So I don't think it'll necessarily change just because we have councils that have financial problems that will mean that they won't therefore get any powers when there are different ways you can raise taxes locally, but also I think one of the interesting questions that kind of isn't explored here is that if Birmingham City Council had passed all of its planning applications and built all those new homes, would it still be in the same financial position that it's in now? If
Labour's going to loosen planning rules, then maybe that will make it easier for councils.
Yeah, and when you look sort of at, for example, Scotland, they've got a more progressive council tax system for generations. Our council tax system has not changed, and Scotland's found a way of kind of protecting those on middle incomes from big council tax rises as well. I don't feel like the consensus is changing just because some councils are having individual problems.
No, I mean, Labour's big bill on this will be the Take Back Control bill. That's their sort of message on devolution. There's not really any detail from them on that. If you press them for it, they'll basically say that it's a way to stop devolution occurring on an ad hoc basis. They want to streamline the process. The coalition government did start a process of devolution, and George Osborne and others were behind the creation of Metro Mayors, and we've seen those be given more money, more powers over the years. I think Labour are broadly on board with that. I do think there's evidence to suggest that there's a scepticism within Keir Starmer's office and maybe from Keir Starmer himself about Metro Mayors. If you look at the relationship between Westminster Labour, Andy Burnham, Sadiq Khan, Jamie Driscoll and other Metro Mayors, it's not been that harmonious. It's not as if they're constantly championing the successes of these Metro Mayors around the country, and that's fine. It doesn't necessarily mean they're not going to take all the power away, but I agree with Rachel. I do think there has been a broad consensus that's been created between the two parties, and we've also got to remember that historically, having powerless local authorities isn't really the norm. It was Thatcher who got rid of so many of the city councils and the GLC in London. I mean, you look back, speaking of Birmingham, look back into the Victorian era and you got someone like Joseph Chamberlain, the mayor there, who invested so much in the city and did so much for local infrastructure. So there is a tradition of devolving lots of power to different places around the country. It's just, and I think we're returning to that more normal situation.
Yeah, and Burnham would probably counter to say, a lot of my schemes are actually saving the Exchequer money. So I think there are, where power has been devolved, there probably are many projects that they can point to say,
like bus franchising.
Yeah. But no one expects that any of these problems will be solved overnight. But I mean, one of the problems that I think councils have more generally is because of this decade of austerity that we've had. Like, people's perception of councils is quite negative in a lot of cases because the services they've received in recent years, because councils individually have had less funding, is quite poor. So that will take time to solve, but I don't think necessarily the overall direction of travel is going to change.
Yes, yeah, and that could have implications for greater devolution, because if you're asking people to vote for a new mayor or a new layer of local government, that scepticism might come into it as well.
Yes, I mean, in the North East is a good example of when they had a referendum on a North East Assembly, and Dominic Cummings, who later became a great winner of referenda. They've run a great campaign against a new layer of government in the North East. They had a big white elephant, and that was the taxpayer will be shelling out more money for new officials. But I think but as I say, I think the direction of travel is now in one direction.
Yeah, although it will be a challenge for Labour coming in, because if you're saying there's all of these, how many did you say? 26 small councils down the line. And even the ones that aren't on the brink of bankruptcy are in quite bad financial situations, Labour are going to have to do something to help them.
Right. Yeah, I mean,
and that's going to be very costly.
Yeah, what is the point of devolution if they don't have any money to implement policy or even just sustain the services that you normally expect from a council? So the devolution question is interesting, but I think the more fundamental question is, are they going to redress the lack of funding that we've seen in the past 10 years or so? Because that's in many ways, as we've discussed, one of the reasons that people feel that they need more power locally. They need their local issues solved and addressed by the council, just because the council doesn't have the money to do it. Is Labour going to redress that problem? I think that's a broader question almost than whether they continue with devolution.
Well, this is what I saw when I went to Jacob Rees-Mogg's seat, North East Somerset, and where a number of bus services have been cut, really affecting people's lives, because in those rural areas there's very little way of getting around without driving. And they've got a West of England mayor there, they've got Bristol City Council, they've got North East Somerset Council, I think. And between all of these different bodies, something like 42 bus routes had fallen by the wayside, and none of them were taking responsibility for it. So you see what happens when the money isn't there, but there's all these different devolved layers of government. It doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to get what they want. And
another problem with the West of England Metro Mayor system is that it requires consensus between the council leaders, but unlike somewhere like Manchester, there is a split between Labour and the Conservatives, and there's no consensus possible.
Thanks so much for watching. We'd love to know what you think. Please make sure you leave your comments below. And if you enjoyed watching this podcast, you can watch more of our videos on our YouTube channel. And don't forget to like and subscribe.